Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. The second panel for this morning will be Belonging and the Built Environment, moderated by Professor Prema Rajgopalan of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Madras. Let me take this opportunity to introduce the speakers as well. Arundev VR, a research scholar from the Central University of Tamil Nadu, will be presenting his paper titled Estranging Urban Sprawl, an analysis of the development of Istanbul and the life of the character Mevlut in the novel A Strangeness in My Mind. Following him, Arthriya Dev, pursuing an MPhil in Developmental Studies with specialization in history from the Institute of Developmental Studies, Kolkata, will be presenting his paper, A Spatial Analysis of Markets and Infrastructure and the Right to the City in a Smart City, a case study of Rajarhat, Newtown, Calcutta. This panel will conclude with Divya Malhotra, a doctoral scholar from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She will be presenting a paper on color-coded identity and struggle over land, economics of displacement in Israel. Panelists will be given 15 minutes to present their paper. Panelists who would like to present on screen a presentation or their paper to the audience, please inform your moderator and you will be given presenter access. After the completion of all panelists, the moderator will ask their questions, followed by questions from the members of the panel, followed by members of the audience through the chat box. The session will conclude with the closing remarks by the moderator. This session is recorded for archival purposes. Use of derogatory or offensive language is strictly prohibited and will attract strict actions. I now leave the floor to Professor Prema Rajagopalan to moderate the panel Belonging and the Built Environment.
Good morning. Welcome to this departmental conference completely managed by our students. It has been a very big, I think, effort, especially in this time of social distancing, not seeing each other. So I welcome you and I hope that you will have meaningful takeaways after the conclusion of the session and the conference. So before spending more time now, I invite the first paper presenter, Arun, to start your presentation. You can take exactly 15 minutes because we would like to give the same time to all the three panelists. Can we start?
Yes, ma'am. A small note to the panelists. Our team member Anamika will be timing each of the panelists. So when you reach 14 minutes, she will put it in the chat box. Please have a look at the chat box while you're presenting so that you know how much time is left. Thank you.
Hello, can I share my screen now?
Sure.
Yes,
sure.
sir, you can.
I have a PPT.
Yes, sir, please share.
Yeah, we've given you presenter access so you can share your screen.
Okay, can you share my screen? Can you see my screen?
No, we
Is
can't.
it visible? You can't.
We can see you.
Okay. Okay. Then I'll start without my screen. Okay. The title of my paper is Resistance to Spontaneity, on the representation of urban dynamism in the novel A Strangeness in My Mind by Orhan Pamuk. So this is my title, and Speaking of the novel, A Strangeness in My Mind, this novel was published in 2014, and it was written by the Oscar-winning author Orhan Pamuk. As we all know, Orhan Pamuk is an author from Turkey, and most of his novels are set in the city of Istanbul. Am I audible?
Audible.
Yes, you are.
Yes,
Am I
yes, you are.
audible? Okay. Okay. A Strangeness in My Mind was a novel published in 2014, and like most of the novels of Orhan Pamuk, this is set in the city of Istanbul. Uh, most of the uh, literary works of Orhan Pamuk is like a tribute to the city in which he grew up, and this uh, novel is also not any different. In this novel, Istanbul is not a mere setting of the story. The city itself is presented as a character that exerts its influence on the plot and other characters. And in this novel, we see the transformation of the city of Istanbul from the 1960s to the first decade of the 21st century. And this transformation is seen through the eyes of the central character, Mevlut. The name of the protagonist of this novel is Mevlut. And Mevlut is a man who migrated from Anatolia to Istanbul in his adolescent period, and it is through his eyes that we see the evolution of Istanbul from an ancient city to a modern industrial capitalist city. Levin Amil, in his article, The City Novel, Measuring Referential Spatial Linguistic Temporal Distance, this is the name of his article. In that article, he makes a clear distinction between city novels and other literary works. City novel is itself a genre. What differentiates it from other texts is that when does he tries to answer the question, when does a novel cease to be a text merely set into a city to become a full-fledged city novel? He says that in city novels, the city itself becomes a full character. Urban space is an active presence. Plot development are energized by the urban development and vice versa. Daniel Ake, when he talks about city novel, says that the city reveals and facilitates potential of the character, while simultaneously the character enables the city to reveal and fulfill its potential. In that sense, A Strangeness in My Mind is undoubtedly a city novel because the city of Istanbul, it's an active presence throughout the narrative. It is as if it is the city itself is like a main character in the novel. It exerts its influence in the character development as well as in the plot. Actually, there is a symbiotic relationship between the central character, Mevlut, and the city of Istanbul. Their development is in a symbiotic process. The development of the cities, the evolution, the transformation, the physical transformation of the city is also reflected in the development of Mevlut as a character also. So, it's a city novel. Thinkers such as Henry Lafayette and Louis Mumford proposes that modern capitalist urbanization has disrupted the organic unity of evil towns and dismembered cities, and thus creating a rift between cities and inhabitants. Istanbul, a city with a long history, cultural legacy, underwent the process of urban sprawl in the latter half of the 20th century. One of the main reasons for the explosive expansion of Istanbul was the flow of immigrants from parts of Turkey to the city. Mevlut, a second-generation immigrant who came to the city from a village in Anatolia, witnessed the rapid transformation of Istanbul unfolding before his eyes. This paper tries to analyze how the physical and cultural changes that happened in Istanbul resulted in the alienation and estrangement of the character Mevlut, and how he tried to resist this alienation by pursuing the spontaneous experiences or by the streets of the city. In the book City in History, Louis Mumford says that concerning the city, capitalism was from the beginning anti-historic. It exhibited a strong tendency to erase the past of the city. So this tendency of the capitalist system to erase history, to erase old buildings, cultural practices, etc. They were bulldozed by the capitalist juggernaut. This can be seen in the narrative of the novel also. The old buildings that has the influence of Ottoman architecture, they are replaced by modern buildings during the second half of the 20th century as part of part of the development of an entrepreneurial city. To quote Mumford, the human had no place in the capitalist scheme, or rather, the only constant it recognized were avarice, cupidity, and pride, the desire for power and money. Mevlut can be read as a victim of this dehumanizing character of the modern industrial city. Andy Merrifield, in a critical introduction to Henry Lafayette, summarizes the ideas put forward by Lafayette in his work, The Urban Revolution. Lafayette promulgates a formal schema explaining the different levels and dimensions involved in the process of urbanization. This scheme operates in three dimensions. Lefebvre distinguishes a global level where power is exercised and accommodates the most abstract relations like capital, market, and spatial management. And then there is another level, an everyday level, the private, or is called as the P level. And there is a meso level. It is an intermediate level, the meso level, the urban scale that incorporates and mediates between the global and private. And it is hence the mixed level. So there are three different dimensions or three different levels associated with the urbanization. One is the global level, then there is the everyday lived level, and then there is the meso level, which is the intermediate level between the global and the everyday lived experiences. It is at the meso-urban level that the abstract global reach attains everyday coherence. Lefebvre also talks about cybernanthropes. So what is cybernanthrope? Lefebvre introduces this concept called the cybernanthropes. In modern capitalist system, capitalism exerts power through two strategies. They are neoliberalism and neo-managerialism. And cybernanthropes are the people who controls these neoliberal and neo-managerialist strategies. Cybernanthropes includes bankers, entrepreneurs, industrialists, and also bureaucrats, technocrats, architects, urban planners, politicians. They all comes under this term cybernanthropes. Cybernanthropes are the other plans and organizes a repressive urban space. The problem with cybernanthropes is that they give importance to scientific rationality. They plan and construct spaces which are repressive in nature because they always follow scientific rationality and strictness. It completely ignores human spontaneity and the human lived experiences. That's the problem. There is a fragmentation between the everyday lived experiences and spaces which these cybernanthropes. Economic expansion is the ultimate end of the cybernanthropes and well-being of the inhabitants of the city. This is the main problem. The only objective that drives cybernanthropes is economic expansion. That is this is not in favor of the inhabitants of the city. The inhabitants of the city are considered in. Of the novel, the character Mevlut earns his living bosa seller. Bosa has an alcoholics in the novel. It introduces the beverage traditionally made of fermented wheat with a thick consistency, a pleasant aroma, a dark yellowish color, and a low alcohol content. This beverage quickly turns in the heat. During the time of the Ottoman Empire, Bosa was sold mainly during the winter. After the 1950s, German breweries were established in Istanbul, and thus Bosa lost its demand as people favored drinks with strong alcohol content. After the 1950s, the only street vendor like Mevlet Bosa in the city. By selling a commodity that lost its demand in the print, Mevlet himself turned into a relic or a moving museum that reminded people of antiquity. Mevlet himself was not conscious of his fixation with the past. Even though he was aware of the overwhelming changes sweeping the city, what alienated him was his resistance to change and adapt with time. Urban sprawl offered immediate opportunities for the inhabitants of cities to attain prosperity. Lafavre thinks that more capitalism involves a double process of industrialization and urbanization. Urbanization acts as a second circuit. Lafavre claims that as a mainstay of the capitalist economy, urbanization has industrialization. Capitalism now produces an urban space that is at once an abundant source of surplus value and a massive means of production. Most of the relatives and friends of Mevlet who came to Istanbul started their life as yogurt sellers or dosa sellers in the streets, but they were quick to pounce on other opportunities that came their way. Thus, these people climbing the social ladder by attaining material prosperity, Mevlet found the meaning of his existence in selling bosa, not because it earned him huge income, but because he enjoyed the process of selling by walking through the streets. He found peace of mind, satisfaction by flaneuring the streets of Istanbul. In the urban revolution, in that work, Lafavre discusses how streets become sites of contestations against the scientific rationality of cybernanthropes. Streets defy the language of jargon and technology of cybernanthropes. In Lafavre's words, the invasion of the automobile and the pressure of the industry and its lobbyists have destroyed all social and urban life. They have turned the urban space repressive. Regarding the streets, he says, when you eliminate the streets, there are consequences. The extinction of all life, the reduction of city to a dormitory, to an aberrant functionalization of existence. Streets contains qualities ignored by the cybernanthropes. Mevlet was someone who realized the dynamic, lively qualities of the streets. In this novel, Mevlet tells a story to a group of his customers. The story is about how Ataturk Mustafa Kemal Pasha lifted the ban of street vendors in Istanbul. According to the story, when the Republic of Turkey was established, street vendors were banned from entering the city because there are no street vendors in Europe. Once Ataturk noticed that the usual joy and bustle seemed to be missing from the city. When he came to know that the street vendors are banned in the city, he became angry and declared that street vendors are the songbirds of the street. They are the life and soul of Istanbul, and under no circumstances must they ever be banned from that city. And then on, the street vendors were free to roam the streets of Istanbul. This must be a story made up by Mevlet from his imagination. The view of Mevlet, meaning of his existence in the spontaneity and organic liveliness of the streets. Like the title suggests, Mevlet often is he first felt it when he found out that the woman who eloped with him was not the woman with whom he was really in love. This alienating feeling is also caused by the overwhelming transformation underwent by Istanbul. Istanbul, in his mind, the city that he adores is an illusion. That imaginary city is different from the real city that he inhabits. To escape the alienation, Mevlet embraces the uncertainty, spontaneous experiences, and raw interactions and strangeness of and the interaction with strangers offered by the streets. So, Mevlet is always overcome by a feeling of strangeness. He first felt strange when he found out that the woman with whom he eloped was not the woman he was in love. So that is the kind of relationship he has with the city also. The city that he loves, the city that he adores in his mind is a different city. That is a city of illusion. That city doesn't exist. The real city that he inhabits is a completely different one. he failed to change.
Arun Dev, we are not able to hear you. And your time is up. That's very bad. So,
Okay,
if you
thank
can just, if you can just give your concluding remarks, we can finish with that.
Hello.
If you can conclude your presentation, we can finish with that and move to the next person.
Okay. Through, through, through this, I say that the transformation city is transformed, urban sprawl city. It alienates the inhabitants of the city, and the character Mevlut in this story, he is trying to resist this alienation by embracing the spontaneity offered by the streets. Thank you.
Ma'am, you're muted.
We can go to the next speaker.
Yes, ma'am.
We can go to the next speaker, and I will make my observations once the three papers are finished. So may I now request Atria, please don't read from the paper. Stick to the 15 minutes and try to give the highlights of whatever you have written in your paper. Thank you.
Is my visible? Screen visible?
Yes, Atreya.
Yeah, so the title of my paper is a special analysis of markets, infrastructure, and the right to the city. A case study of Radharat Newtown. Am I audible, right? Hello?
Yes, we can all hear you. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So before situating Radharat Newtown as a particular space and smart city in that respect, I would just like to theoretically foreground my observations regarding Radharat Newtown and then proceed to my analysis. Now, this paper would just like to take off from Karl Marx's analysis of the economic system of capitalism, where he talks about how uh, how capital continuously accumulates itself by the application of living labor. Now, this process requires a continuous reinvestment of capital active living labor and profits generated from capitalism to keep the process running, and also the accumulation going on. This has been cited in Das Kapital, published in 1867, and from there Marx also mentions in a passing comment that capitalism is a very dynamic system of production, and this has fundamental implications for the growth of the capitalist economy, because in terms of dynamism, when technology and other organizational means are applied, there is a situation when there is a crisis of capitalism, and David Harvey called this a situation of over accumulation. So this capitalist crisis cannot be deferred. Sorry, cannot be avoided, but can only be deferred or displaced. It can be temporarily and spatially displaced and dislocated by what David Harvey calls a spatial fix, that is, reinvesting surplus capital and labor in other geographical and temporal locations in order to avoid the capital for the time being. This is how, in his famous article published in the Antipode, he says that he explains the geopolitics of capitalism in contemporary world and says the predictions of capitalism work out. Now, Henry Lefebvre's analysis of the production of social space is also extremely important, where he says that our understanding of space and social relations cannot be separated from an analysis of capitalism. And his concept of dialectics of space, where he modulates three kinds of spaces, that is, spatial practices, spaces of representations, and representations in space, is a very important anecdote in this regard. Now, in a post-colonial economy, when we see this process working out, what we find is that a key point of discussion and a key theme emerging is that of informality. Now, Kalyan Sannal is a notable economist who has worked in this field, and Kalyan Sannal says that when capitalism tries to expand itself in order to temporarily and spatially dislocate impending crisis of capitalism,
Atreya,
tries
1 minute. Can you change your slides? It's only in the first slide.
yeah, I have not yet arrived. I have not yet
Okay.
arrived to the main content. Just give me a second. Okay. Just last time introducing my thing. So Kalyan Sannal said that capitalism continuously creates its other in the process of appropriating, but the expansion gets stalled due to the presence of a large sector of what he calls surplus labor or the need economy. And this is why in a post-colonial context, capitalism and informality are intrinsically connected. And this informal need economy is connected to the accumulation economy, which is a formal part of capitalism through a survival circuit of surplus labor. Now, in India, the discussion of cities has been a key parameter of development since the times of Nehru, when we saw cities were planned according to a socialist model of growth. But after that, and steel towns were developed, and the cartographic representation of the state was done. But after that, in the post-reforms period, we see that Kalyan Sannal and Rajesh Bhattacharya talk about how Indian government is following a bypass approach to urbanization, and this is how the post-reforms neoliberal state in India is trying to plan its cities in order to present a particular developmentalist logic. And Rajarhat can be situated in this context. So the new cities and the smart towns plan, smart cities plan, which Narendra Modi promotes, of proposing 100 smart cities across the country, is trying to combine big data, finance, capital in order to create out exclusive places and zones of smart locations which escape the filth of the old metropolis. But Sanyal and Bhattacharya rightly point out that these new spaces of exclusivity remain connected to the older metropolis through a survival circuit. Now, this is the cartographic representation of Rajarhat in the Annals of Planning and Policy collected from the archives of the NKDA, which is the Newtown Kolkata Developmental Authority. Now, when Rajarhat was planned, this refers to Ananya Roy's work on informality as a planning regime in India. For example, Ananya Roy says that the very planning of these cities is implicated with informality, and informality permeates in every section of these plans. So initially, this is the current plan that has been taken, but initially the city was planned in the form of blocks. But then the clear land use pattern was also mentioned in the 1999 master plan, but that has been totally bypassed, and the city has been built in an ad hoc manner. And today we see that it has been abruptly planned in the form of action areas. And action area 3 and 4 have not taken off as of yet. And the NKD has also failed to provide any form of basic infrastructural facilities to the people who have promised these facilities. Now, when I went to do my field work in this location, I saw that due to the lack of infrastructure, now infrastructure is not only the material existence of the infrastructure, and it has a deep connection with the liberal ideology. Infrastructure also has a social life of its own, and this has been outlined by Nikhil Anand and various other scholars of anthropology. And then here I am referring to the anthropological literature on infrastructure. And here we see that marginalized people who were not promised space in the city, which is exclusive, are filling in these infrastructural gaps and connecting the nodes. For example, you see that here is a transport infrastructure of Rajarhat, which is connected, taking advantage of this informality the marginalized people are filling in these gaps. And here, the local political formations are like the trade union of the Trinamool Congress, or earlier it was the C2, have kind of developed patron-client relationships, and which is similar to Pathwadaji's argument of the political society. So this kind of space-making practices of the marginalized are making possible certain modes of inhabitation in the city which excludes them. Now, Nikhil Anand says that infrastructure can become a site for negotiation and politics in his work Hydraulic City. And Abdul Malik Simon's argument about the people as infrastructure, where he says that people at the margins of the city make possible certain modes of association to make their claims to the city. These are claims and not rights in the proper sense to the city. This can be clearly manifested from this slide. This is the picture of the unionized auto stand in front of the Axis Mall, which can be seen. Now, secondly, various forms of infrastructural networks like electricity, like infrastructure, kind of converge in marketplaces. Marketplaces are key sites where you can see that these kinds of infrastructural networks converge to create assemblages. The markets can be seen as an assemblage which stands on the top of these infrastructural networks. But there are various kinds of markets. For example, the marginal people are making their claim to Rajarat through ad hoc representation, ad hoc arrangements, like you see a solar panel here in front of a stall, or you will see that the stalls are makeshift, and these exist. These were not formally a part of the master plan. And these placemaking practices are what I am referring to as the modes of exercising the right to the city. But these are not rights in the conventional terminology of liberalism, but these are more of claims to the city in an post-colonial context. But on the contrast, you see a block market here where the NKDA clearly supplies and enumerates the stalls. There is a stall number given. They have submitters, and they also have clear electricity bills, and they have to pay rents for these shops. It is a permanent market, and these markets become important sites for community formation in a segregated city of Rajarat New Town, and people of the middle class get to interact and form bonds with the people who are selling goods. And the old Bengali argument of Deepesh Chakraborty, where he tries to lay out the discursive practice of Adda as a arena for community formation, can be seen in this regard. Then we can also see the presence of vendors who keep on moving in the streets of Rajarat New Town, and they negotiate the city from the margins. And these are also practices which are very important to understand how people kind of represent their claims to the city. But on the side of the state, we can I encountered the chairman of the NKDA in an event where he tried to promulgate a scheme for rejuvenating and make the streets of the city of Rajarat New Town clean and pedestrian friendly. It was named the Streets for People. He clearly summoned old Bengali scenic beauty of Darjeeling to kind of market a scheme, and he mentioned that this is kind of being funded by the CSR funds of MNC, that is Deloitte. But he continuously used rhetoric like people's participation and streets for the people in order to legitimize his otherwise exclusive plan for Rajarat. And the people in the informal economy of Rajarat only feature in his talk or in his rhetoric as an economic necessity of Rajarat who cannot be avoided. So in this sense, we can easily understand how capitalist expansion has remained deeply connected with the informal context with the post-colonial context and informality forms a key nodal axis and mediating factor in order to understand these placemaking practices. And lastly, I would also like to say that I just kind of also try to interact with the middle class who depend on these people for regular negotiations, and they kind of form a share a habitat. And our architect who won a prize, who was awarded a prize for a best plan, which he submitted. The plans were to be submitted, and then the state would kind of consult with the plans on how citizens imagine the city. Now, the architect said two things emerged. One was that these people are economically necessary for the survival of the city, and you need them. You can allocate them at specific places, and you do definitely need them. But another logic is of public nuisance, that these people create a public nuisance for the city. Now, from this, we can see that the middle class is having a clear dilemma about uh, this people in the margins, and hence you cannot find a conclusion and concluding evidence, and this is why they are able to practice this placemaking practices to assert their claims to the city. Now, uh, there are three grounds of research that this study might proceed, and my research also looks at. One is Rajarhat has been called as a wasteland of capital or a dystopia by Ranavir Samantar. But I want to understand that is this a dystopia at all, or is it a dystopia because these people are asserting their claims to the city? And if this is a dystopia, it is a dystopia for which section? More for the middle class who didn't get the infrastructure, or these people? Secondly, Ranavir Samantar, Abdul Malik Simon, Ratullah Kundu all talk about a possibility of a just 1 minute, 30 seconds of a emergence of a multitude according to word of Hart and Negri. But the state is fragmenting the multitude as seen. So is there a real possibility of the emergence of a multitude? And will the middle class ever be possible to kind of get over their dilemma, or there is a scope for mutual collaboration in their in the existence since they share a habitat? Thank you.
Thank you, Atreya. Can we go to the third and final speaker, Divya? Are you around?
Good morning. Yes, ma'am. I'll just
Yeah.
start sharing my screen.
Sure.
I'm requesting presenter access. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hope my screen is visible.
It is.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And the title of my paper is Color Coded Identity and Struggle Over Land, Economics of Space and Displacement in Israel. My background as such is in economics, and my work for my PhD is on foreign policy of Israel. So it's my first attempt on the subject of spatiality, and I hope I do justice to it. I'll begin by giving a brief introduction of the country as such. And as a nation, Israel is an act of imagination, which accommodated the hopes and dreams of Jews across the globe. But as a state, its borders are still blurred, disputed, and undefined, even after 70 decades of independence. The maps keep changing, the borders keep shifting. There is a lot of literature on Israel-Palestine conflict and geopolitics, but there's relatively little discussion on the role of colored identity cards and its impact on internal displacement. This paper is an attempt to understand the spaces and spatiality in Israel based on the notion of colored identities and how it impacts various communities in Israel. I start by showing a world map, and Israel, if you can locate, is just a dot on the world map, the red dot here. And if we look closer at the country's geography, the yellow area here shows the geography of Israel. The gray part here is the disputed part, which is counted as Jerusalem. So this country, which is spread a little over 20,000 square kilometers, almost the size of Indian state of Mizoram, has been the epicenter of the most enduring conflict, which began in the first half of 20th century and still has no solution. And with the founding of the state of Israel in 1948, the entire region turned into a conflict zone between Jews and Arabs, both of whom have been laying claims to the same territory. The history of the conflict as such goes way behind 1948. The idea of a Jewish state in a Palestinian territory began to take form in 1980s. The idea was given by Theodor Herzl, who had the vision of having a Jewish homeland there. After he had shared his vision, like-minded Jews, mainly in Eastern Europe, began to undertake Aliyah. Aliyah is a Hebrew term for return of people to the promised land. And they portrayed it as a return of people to the promised land rather than moving to a new land. And it was justified or legitimized as their historic right or a divine right of the Jews to be in that region. In 1909, the first all-Jewish city of Jaffa was established, and by 1914, already over 80,000 Jews were living in Palestine. Now, the idea of ownership of land was central to the vision of a Jewish homeland. In the words of the head of Jewish National Fund, the first task of a landless community or a landless people is to provide this foundation for their existence. Without land, there can be no agriculture, no industry, and no urban settlement. So Jewish individuals and small institutions, they had started buying land from Arabs legally, and I emphasize it here. And by 1948, 1/5 of the cultivable land was with the Jewish community. And it's a photo of a documentation being done between two Jews who are buying land from the Arab. And on the other hand, what was happening in Eastern Europe, that there was a mass scale alienation of Jews there, and in 90s and 30s. And under Adolf Hitler, when Holocaust took place, it had united the Jews across the globe, and it further pressed for the need of a Jewish homeland. Finally, in 1947, the UN General Assembly Resolution 181 had called for partition of British-ruled Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. This resolution was accepted by the Jews, but was rejected by the Arabs. And ever since, these two communities have been at conflict with each other. If you can see the map, the blue areas were designated for the Jews under Israeli jurisdiction, and the red areas were given to the Arabs. And the yellow area here, Jerusalem, was at that time under the UN. It was an international mandate. Now, talking about the perspective of both the sides, for Jews, the creation of Israel as a Jewish state was perceived as a legitimate divine right, a historic right to return to their promised land. While for Arabs and Palestinians, it was seen as al-Nakba, an Arabic term which means a catastrophe or a colossal loss of Palestine. However, we can't merely see it as a zero-sum game, where one community gains and the other loses. The two communities, however, were forced to live together in a very small, in a petite and an explosive geography, and they found it difficult to coexist. It is here that notions of space or spatiality may offer a unique perspective to the conflict. For my paper, for my study, I'd gone through the ideas of these researchers, a lot of whom have been discussed in detail by speakers before me, also David Harvey, Henry Lefebvre, Doreen Macy, Thrift. And in their respective body of work, they have discussed in detail the notions of space and also time, how space and time are distinct and yet integral to one another, how they help to capture the way worlds are thought, how they're produced and inhabited by different communities. Talking about borders, frontiers, and boundaries, they tend to affect the everyday constructions of space, whether it's in terms of economic opportunities, workspace, market space, socio-cultural institutions, or neighborhood organizations and interactions. So by that logic, the founding of an entirely new nation state had important implications on the actual and also the perceived understanding of social space for Jews as well as the non-Jews. Now, there is a case of spatial duality in Israel. On one hand, there is a continuous and fluid Israeli space in which it is possible to commute quickly. Everything, all the opportunities are rather easily available. Conversely, there is a fragmented Palestinian space with slow movement and obstacles. So Israel presents a case where two populations are coexisting in two different time regimes, as has also been discussed in detail by a lot of researchers, whom I have mentioned in detail in my paper. There are also certain other travel related privileges. If a blue ID card holder, which I'll also talk about in detail later, blue ID card holders are the Arab Israelis or Israeli citizens. They buy a car in Jerusalem in one part, they will get a yellow license plate, as you can see here, while the Arabs are generally, who are not Israeli citizens, are given a separate number plate, from which they can be clearly identified. So this tends to expand the space for a particular community and tends to reduce it for the other. Now, reflecting on ethno-religious differentials in Israel amongst Jews and also between Jews and non-Jews, they tend to reflect in access to essential socio-economic infrastructure, whether it is access to education or healthcare or distribution of wages. And the observed hierarchy of access is that the European Jews, that is the white Jews or the Jews who came from Europe, they have the highest access to healthcare or all these other socio-economic facilities, followed by the Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi Jews are the Middle Eastern Jews, the Arab Jews or the Persian Jews who prior to formation of Israel were either living in Iran or in the surrounding Arab countries. Then Sephardi Jews are generally, it's a general term for Asian Jews, which also includes Indian Jews. And lastly, the Arab Israelis, the Arab population. My own study in 2016, which focused on Israel's healthcare, access to secondary healthcare, had also suggested a similar hierarchy in access to healthcare. I'd interviewed 30 Jews and 19 Arabs in my sample, and a similar hierarchy was noticed, once again mentioned in detail in the study. Now, coming to the history of ID cards, to the history of ID cards, what is important is the geography or the region of Jerusalem. So basically, 1 year after Israel was formed, the division of Jerusalem was finalized, and under the UN agreement, a green line, if you can see here, was passed, which divided the city into two halves: West Jerusalem on the west side and East Jerusalem. West Jerusalem was under Israel's authority, and East Jerusalem at that time was under Jordan's control. However, after the 1967 war, the Jordanian half also, this half also was brought under Israel's jurisdiction. And at that time, Israel had decided to conduct a population census in order to find out the Palestinian population of the region. And the approximate population at that time of Palestinians was 68,000. Now, these Palestinians were given two options. Either they could get a permanent residency status in East Jerusalem. So they could be the residents of East Jerusalem, but not Israeli citizens. So they were given non-blue ID cards, which I'll come to in the next slide. And those who opted to become Israeli citizens were asked to undergo a universal naturalization process, and they were given blue ID cards. So the first stage of identity segregation was based on nationality. Israeli citizens would get blue ID cards and the Palestinians would get non-blue ID cards. The second stage of identity segregation was made on the basis of religious affiliation and geography. Within the blue Israeli citizen IDs, shades of blue would also differ. The Arabs who opted for Israeli citizenship were given light blue cards, which were slightly different from the regular blue ID cards given to the Jewish citizens of Israel. And the residents of Gaza Strip were given maroon ID cards, and the Palestinians in West Bank were given orange ID cards. Just to show you, this is how the maroon card looked. These are the orange cards. However, in 1993, when Oslo Peace Accords took place, Palestinian Authority was formed, and the task of giving IDs to Palestinians was given from Israeli authorities to Palestinian authorities, and they had replaced green cards with, they had replaced the orange and maroon cards with a unique, a single color for both green cards. Although it was optional, some Palestinians still retain orange and maroon cards, but mostly now it's just blue and green. At the center of this entire conflict has been the city of Jerusalem, to which all the three communities, Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, and Jews, lay an equal right. But administratively, it comes under the state of Israel and is seen as their capital. Eye of the Storm is the old city of Jerusalem. It exhibits an interesting case of living together separately. And more interestingly, the area is just 1 square kilometer. This is the map. It's this old city, which is divided into 4 parts: the Christian quarter here, the Muslim quarter, Jewish quarter, and Armenian quarter. And this part here, where the Muslims have the mosque and the Jews have their Wailing Wall, all of them have very important religious sites here, which makes the area very important. And this is the Dome of Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque here, and right behind it is the Western Wall. So the area as such is very small, smaller than 1 square kilometer, but densely populated by different groups. This is just a photo of the Jewish quarter, how this looks, and mostly inhabited by religious Jews. This is a photo from the Muslim quarter. You'll see a lot of graffitis on walls for Palestinian liberation. These are the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces soldiers, who are guarding the Arab streets. This is a photo from the Christian quarter, and many times you'd also see Indian Christians who go there for pilgrims. And this is the smallest quarter, the Armenian quarter. So basically, each quarter is seen as a safe, exclusive, and free space for political deliberations, and it's a symbol of collective identity for each of the communities. Now, two important points garner attention here. First, in order to maintain the long-run demographic structure of a Jewish state, the state authorities issue blue card to limited Arabs. Although Arabs have the option of applying for it, Israel still has the right to deny citizenship on any grounds, and they offer these citizenship cards, the blue cards, to limited Arabs. Secondly, in light of perceived security threat from Arabs to the state of Israel, the color of ID imposes a certain travel and movement restriction. A system of permits governs the movement of green card holders in Israeli territory, and they also have to secure a travel permit in advance, whether irrespective of where they want to travel. This is how the wall separates the city, and the Palestinians have to pass through this to get their permits checked. Now, there's a case of dichotomy here, even as political opinions of Jews and Arabs are divided. There are some Arabs who opt for a blue card and identify themselves as citizens of Israel. Now, my own interaction with two Arab women, one who was a blue card holder and one who was a green card holder in a border city of Tiberias, it brought to fore two different perspectives. Now, when I interacted with the blue card holder, she was a young research scholar based in Tel Aviv. She shared that her main motivation behind availing a blue card and an Israeli citizenship, socio-economic. First, she talks about gendered space. Even though as an Arab, her emotions are aligned with the Arab cause and a Palestinian cause, her social identity as a woman in Arab society would limit her economic opportunities and life chances. There are limitations on Arab women's social mobility. They're not allowed to drive vehicles, their movement at night. There are general patriarchal norms. As an Israeli citizen, she said, I'm independent and I can drive to work, a luxury which she may not get in the Palestinian territories or in Arab society. She also says that Arab green card holders have to compete in the labor market, not only with Jews, but also with Arabs with blue cards. So as a blue card Arab, I eliminate one line of competition and improve my social standing. Now, the green card holding Arab women, on the other hand, labeled Arabs' choice of a blue card as a duality and betrayal to Palestinian cause. She saw it as an opportunistic behavior. Even though blue card Arabs may get better opportunities, this alienation will still manifest itself, as she shared, in the form of competition in recruitment, how they are treated at the workplace, job appraisals, wages, and promotions. Interestingly, she also said that in some cases, the social and cultural space in Palestinian society diminishes as they're not welcomed in Arab circles. So they're at a risk of dual alienation. So this is a kind of trade-off that generally takes place. The blue card holders, they're likely to get a better space and inclusion within Israel, but at the cost of losing some space in Palestinian society. The green card Palestinians might witness a lesser space in Israel, but they retain their space in the Palestinian society because of their contribution to the Arab cause. Now, it's similar in the workplace. Workplaces are a very active arena of social interaction. A lot of researchers have said that even though in residential spaces in Israel, there is very limited interaction and social relations between Arabs and Jews, and they have that communication under control. Within the workplace, the Jews and Arabs have daily contacts, which they can't avoid. I've taken the first case of Asaf Dar, who had done the study based on his interactions with medical staff in a hospital and a retirement home, and he says that the most open manifestation of this hostility generally is in the form of racist comments. Secondly, in 2016, Jerusalem was witnessing a sudden spurt in stabbing incidents. At that time, there was a request made to the municipalities to lay off Arab construction laborers because of the heightened fear among Jews. And lastly is a case of an Arab doctor, famous Arab endocrinologist, who treats diabetic patients in ultra-Orthodox suburb of Bnei Brak. In a newspaper interview, he shared that he had never really faced such racist comments, and usually they come from people who are generally uneducated and closed-minded, but he gets a lot of nice feedback. So probably this threat, fear, and demand for replacement of Arab staff at that time was localized to the epicenter of violence, that is Jerusalem. Now, there is also a change in this attitude. I'm just concluding. Yeah. Change in attitude in the younger generations called the Zabir Jews, who are the young Jews born in Israel, and likewise Israel-born Arabs also. Because they generally have these youth, they have moderate political opinions. If they come from families with higher incomes and secular disposition, and they tend to interact more often, they favor coexistence. My own interaction with a Jewish couple also brought out similar insights that youngsters are mainly focused on economic aspirations rather than discussing politics and getting into heated debates. I conclude by saying that Israel presents a unique case of a united, polarized environment true to most conflict zones. Can Israel achieve a better balance compatible with visions of both sides, accommodating an Arab minority without losing its Jewish character is a question to which I don't have an answer, and probably nobody that does. My only suggestion here is that maybe economics and spatial economics offers a different optic and a fresh insight. By flattening of space, by overcoming systematic institutional barriers to economic sustenance, an apolitical space which is alienated from the tense political realities can be created in order to have a parallel political space which is not as politically negative or charged. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Divya.
Thank you.
So I'll quickly make my observations on the three papers before I kind of call on you to respond and to open the floor to the audience to make their whatever observations, departure points, or raise questions. Now, this has been a very interesting panel of three papers, one based on primary data, one based on secondary data, and the third probably partial fiction. The methodology, of course, also is a very interesting, I would say, mix. And we always say that, you know, the built environment represents the culture. But we also argue that culture can alter the built environment, isn't it? So the built environment and culture are very, very strongly linked. In the three papers that I have listened to, we have had in this session, the first one talks of how the built space through a natural process of change and maybe development interventions can alienate people. So, how it distances them from something that has been very close. The second one talks of development, new spaces, built environments which are created. There are organic settlements and there are planned settlements, and how there the concept of ownership and belonging is very nicely brought out. Since all of you are research scholars, I'm sure that the final output of your thesis will bring in very, very interesting insights. Probably you're all midway in your research and thesis. And the third paper is even more interesting, where we talk of not, you know, like the first one and the second one, of how specific spaces, but how it's just the space itself which is politically created, which is not displacement because of development, which is not displacement because of disaster, but due to larger questions. And along with this, the question of identity, in some way, directly or indirectly, all the papers have brought in very, very, I would say, significantly. My query to not much, there may primarily observations. Talking, the first paper talked about alienation, and but I thought maybe that paper needs a little more refinement, because I think Arun, you brought in more background about other things than about the specific novel. So about that character, Mevlut, I would look forward to greater expression of, you can say, dimensions of alienation in greater detail. I'm sure when you publish it as a paper, you will dwell more on that than on the theoretical background and things like that.
Yes, ma'am. This is actually a work in process. There are progress. There
Yeah.
are much more things to add to it.
Yeah, so that did not really come out. That is the dimensions of alienation. You know, alienation is simply not workspace, emotional space, build space. So I would expect much more detail on the dimensions of alienation that the character goes through. because of the changes in the built environment to which he belonged. You said that he came as a second generation immigrant. So you go through this. I mean, this is something that all of us face. We leave a city, we go away to study or to work, and we come back to the city where we are born, city or town or village, and we are not able to connect or to relate. So even there it happens. And for somebody who's living through those changes, so what are the different dimensions of alienation that the character faces? That would be interesting to kind of read. For Atria, uh, this I think, I mean, I don't know your thesis, the focus of your thesis, but it's a very interesting mix of how capitalist intervention has accommodated the informal economy. And this is something that is researched a lot in urban sociology, where we talk about, these gated communities and the slums that just rise, uh, evolve just outside, because you need the people. And especially what is interesting for me is the final, I would say, notes that you made about the middle class people and their relation to this, which is, I think, I mean, the rich are different, the poor, but the middle class, how do they connect and how do they give space to these marginalized sections? And then, of course, their integration into these new towns. So this integration does not happen, though we do have projects in affordable housing where they say that, I mean, along with, they do get some tax benefits to integrate affordable housing quarters, that is generally for the marginalized, for the poor, so that they enjoy the benefits of a gated community, but are also, I think, I mean, in some sense segregated physically, whatever. But then how this kind of inclusive growth, there are efforts, but still it is not something that is very common. So the relationship between the middle class and the marginalized, and there, as you said, it is not a right, is it's a claim, and it is, as you said, need economy. So that link, if you can show some more data or whatever, that would be interesting. For Divya, I am totally an outsider to international relations. I do sociology, but your very crucial, I would say, focus on identity, creation of identity, the collective identity and the individual identity, that sometimes contradicts, that sometimes complements. So where you said how collective identity by these segregated ghettoist quarters, and also the individual identity of asking for those different shades of whatever cards, identity cards. So that kind of a relationship is very interesting. And as I told you, your paper totally is, it's not like the other two, where a specific localized space. It is something that is not only within that region, but it is of concern globally. Like you mentioned, conflict. It's a kind of a space for conflicts. I remember somebody wanted to at one point study why is Jantar Mantar always seen as a space for protests. So something like that. So how that space is constantly identified as a conflict zone and how it impacts on the identity. I really enjoyed listening to all the papers. I don't have specific questions to any of you. You are all doing your PhD thesis. I wish you all the very best, that your thesis comes out very well and you have important insights to share with the larger, I would say, community. Now, if questions from the audience, from the other scholars, from others who are present, um, can be raised, then we can have a discussion. Or if the panelists want to add anything or to respond, that is also welcome.
Ma'am, can I say something?
Sure, Divya.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your remarks. Actually, just like you said, you are an outsider to IR. Actually, I am also an outsider to this entire field, and this paper itself is a derived research, because my field visits to Israel were for the study on the foreign policy, and based on my observations, I realized that it's a conference where I can bring out this aspect also. So maybe I was kind of encroaching upon the space of the discipline, but nevertheless, because the discussions are getting so interdisciplinary, it gives us scope. And I would also like to compliment the work by the previous two researchers. I got a lot of good ideas and concepts, which maybe I can discuss with them later separately and share my paper for review also. Discussions on market spaces and people as infrastructure. I think all of that I can see, it can find application in Israeli space as well. So that's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I say, can I say something?
Sure. Atreya.
Yeah, so to the first presenter, I would just like to compliment him for the excellent paper and presentation that he brought before us. But Arun, if I would just like to ask you a couple of questions, like not questions per se, but observations, which ma'am also talked about when she was mentioning about the alienation of space, the dimensions of alienation. So if you could just like kind of talk about the whole debate around the NRC, like when legal connotations of citizenship are brought into identify migrants, and the very idea of quasi citizenship as as Kendall talks about, or Ganendra Pandit talks about, how does a migrant relate to that? Because some people in the third paper by Divya also see we are partial migrants, some people partial citizens, some people are given complete citizen, and there is the entire economy of patron client relationships where there is trade-offs. And how do you relate to that? So we see a very contested political debate around NRC today, and this entire discourse of the outsider. And different states of India like responding different. For example, Assam is an outlier case here, rather than Bengali, from where I belong. And to Divya, I had specific two observations. Like in the Israeli case, like yeah. So in the Israeli case, when you talk about manifestations of space, and since you use Darren Massey, the feminist geographer, I would just like to like ask you that since Massey talks about the integration of space and time in our analysis of space, how does the temporal analysis work in the presence of women in particular street life? Because when I was doing my fieldwork in other art or other places also, because I have also worked previously among the IT sector labor and the night shift, the concept of night shift or the issue of maternity leave. So related to this causes and the economy of effect. So how does the presence or absence and the body language of women or queer spaces, where I see a special panel in this conference also. So how does that manifest itself in the streets of Radarat, streets of Israel, or the or the quotidian practices of Israel? And secondly, I have another observation related to your paper, which I find particularly interesting because I am from a political science background, and I have a basic training of international relations. So related to that, I would just like to know how the state making as a practice kind of get produced from the margins, and how is the state constituted and the public constituted in anthropological literature. We find a lot of that discussion through Akhil Gupta's work of the everyday state, or work of other scholars of anthropology, or even Michel Foucault. So how do you see that state making practices through quotidian practices of life in Israel? Because that is a discourse that I want to really explore the Arab-Israeli conflict. Thank you so much.
Can I respond your queries?
Yes,
Am I
yes,
audible?
Arun, quickly. Arun, and then Divya, if you want to respond.
Okay. Atreya, you were referring to this NRC issue and its relation with my thesis. See, I was talking about Henri Lefebvre in my thesis. Henri Lefebvre is a French urban theorist. He talks about this concept called citoyens and citadins. You were also referring about the right to the city in your thesis. Uh, when Lefebvre talks about citoyens and citadins, citoyens are the original inhabitants of the city. They are the people who have been living there for a very long time, for centuries. And citadins, they are the newcomers. They come there as laborers, they come there as migrants. And see, his argument is that both citoyens and citadins, they have equal right to the city. There is no partiality in the right to the city. Both the citoyens and citadins has equal rights to the city. And this as the issue is also related with the citoyens and citadins. Who is the original inhabitant and who is the outsider, who is the newcomer? Then talking in my thesis, I was talking about Mevlut. Mevlut was a character who came, he migrated from Anatolia to Istanbul, and he lived there for almost 40 years, 45 years he lived in Istanbul, and he considered himself as an inhabitant of Istanbul. He has nothing to do with the village from which he came. He himself considers a part of Istanbul. But whenever I told you that he's a bosa seller, he goes to the streets to sell bosa, and whenever he goes out to the streets, there are people who ask him, "Do you still?" Odd questions. People ask him odd questions like, "Do you still? Do you have electricity in your village? Do you have schools in your village?" Such kinds of odd questions are asked to Mevlut, with the supposition that he is a villager. He's not an urban dweller. He's still a villager. Even after living there for 40 years, he's still considered as an outsider, still considered as a villager. And this is the same question that is encountered by the people. Like the state is asking them to come with documents, with papers to prove that they are the they are the children of the soil, that they belong here. So that kind of alienation is there in both cases.
Yes, Divya?
Yes, ma'am. Okay. Thank you for your questions and observations, Atreya. First, actually, I have not really looked at gender as a specific variable in any of, I mean, particularly for this study, and in general also, I don't really work on gender. But since you've asked, how gender segregation, what kind of gender segregation is there in Israel? First is, within, between Arabs and Jews, I think the most basic segregation happens when there is a norm of conscription in Israel, that men and women both are expected to serve in the military. Men for 3 years and women for 2.5 years. And for Arabs, that's not a norm. And in fact, because of the political tensions, they don't even opt for it. So that's where the most basic segregation happens between, Jewish women and Arab women as such. However, what I noticed when I was studying for this paper was that I mentioned also that the new generation, the Zabur Jews, the Israel-born Arabs, they tend to interact more, in street life also, and as such in workplaces also. So, they are trying to overcome it because now that they are entering into third and fourth generations, they are getting slightly detached from the memories of 1948. Eventually, I think that happens in any conflict zone. So that way, but it differs from institution to institution. If you look at the institution of marriage, there are very few Arab-Jewish marriages. Nonetheless, such couples generally move out. They don't get much space and acceptance within their respective communities in Israel. So that is my observation. But nevertheless, it's a good point. I would like to involve it maybe in this paper or a separate paper, but never really looked at gender specifically. So maybe you can share more with me later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any questions, observations from the audience? Do we have any observations, departure points? Our other students? You're all listening and learning. If there isn't much, can the organizers let me know?
Oh, yes, ma'am. As of now, we haven't received any questions yet.
So should we wind up the session?
Yes, ma'am. Any questions at all? Okay, I think we can close the session then because we have to start the next session at 12.
Yeah, okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this conference and our student representatives who've taken all the effort to conduct the conference, come what may. And to you panelists, wherever you are, wish you all the very good luck in your academic endeavors. Uh, and and I suppose you have another day and a half of the conference. You may get more inputs from other kind of perspectives, which will give you ideas to strengthen your own research work. So thanks a lot to everybody, to the panelists and to the organizers and to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank
you, ma'am.
you, Sir Prema Rajagopalan, and for that enriching session. The